The night had no mercy. Even the stars seemed to be hiding, and the moon was a sliver of silver that offered nothing but faint outlines. John Hale knew this was the moment when the world had changed. He held his children close, two small bodies trembling against his chest, their eyes wide in the dark. It was not the first night he had done this, but he had never felt the weight of the shadows so intensely. They moved differently now, more patient, more precise, like predators who had learned the patterns of their prey. He had noticed it first when Emily, the elder, had stopped asking the questions he had always found comforting. Where do monsters come from? Why do bad things happen? Instead, she watched the shadows in silence, her small hands gripping his jacket. Marcus, barely 5, clutched at her arm, his wide eyes darting in every direction. John understood in that moment. The danger had grown intelligent. It was no longer a matter of fleeing from brute force. It studied them, waited for the perfect opportunity, and it would not hesitate. It was a whisper in the wind that first alerted him, a sound so slight that he almost ignored it. But the second he did, a figure materialized at the edge of the clearing. No face, no expression, only presence. The kind of presence that made the blood in his veins turn cold. John had learned to recognize it. It was not human. It was the thing that had followed him for weeks, unrelenting, understanding him in ways he could not comprehend. He led his children silently through the woods, stepping over roots, pausing at fallen trees, listening. Every snapped twig was an alarm, every rustle of leaves a threat. He whispered instructions in a voice as calm as he could manage. Walk in line, follow my steps, do not speak unless spoken to. He had practiced this routine for weeks. The wilderness was their shield, but only if they respected its rules. One wrong move, one sound too loud, and they would all be lost. John's mind raced. He had been a father long before this nightmare began, but he realized that night that parenthood was no longer a role. It was a weapon, a shield, a calculated strategy. Every choice he made now carried the weight of life and death, and his decisions were no longer about comfort or morality, they were about survival. He understood fully that the only way to keep them safe was to offer himself as bait, to draw the hunter away from the innocent, to channel all danger into one concentrated path, himself. As they crept toward an abandoned cabin he had scouted days earlier, John could feel the eyes following, always just at the edge of vision. It had been observing, learning. It mirrored every decision he made, and sometimes, just for a moment, he swore it smiled. The wind shifted, the children shivered, and John's throat tightened. He had only one plan. If they were to survive, he would have to disappear into that darkness willingly, become the target, and hope it was enough. The cabin appeared as a silhouette against the dark horizon. Its roof sagged, and the door creaked on its hinges. He opened it carefully, ushering Emily and Marcus inside, ensuring they could hide and breathe quietly. He whispered that they should stay put, that he would return. It was not a lie in the way one tells a lie to deceive. It was a promise of sacrifice. He would face the danger, and they would live to see another dawn. Outside, the snow fell silently, coating the ground in white that swallowed sound and left no trace. John stepped into it with deliberate movements, calculating where each footfall would land, how the light might reflect off the snow, how the hunter might perceive his approach. The figure appeared again, as inevitable as death, but he met it without fear. He had no fear. Fear was a luxury he had discarded in the pursuit of his children's survival. He had replaced it with a cold, methodical precision, and it served him as well as any weapon could. "You cannot run forever," the shadow said. Its voice neither male nor female, its tone precise and deliberate. "I do not intend to," John replied calmly. "I am where I need to be." The creature considered him, and for a moment, it seemed to tilt its head as though puzzled by his audacity. Then it shifted, a movement too smooth, too unnatural, and John realized the depth of the game he was in. This was not a simple pursuit. This was strategy. Every moment, every hesitation, every breath mattered. And yet, he found a clarity in it, a brutal, cruel logic that cut away everything unnecessary. His children were alive because he had decided to make himself expendable. That knowledge steadied him like iron. Hours passed. He lured it away from the cabin, drawing it into the forest paths he had memorized, each one narrow and overgrown. He led it through ravines and frozen streams, keeping just enough distance to remain unseen but close enough to ensure it tracked him. The snow muffled their steps, and the moon, still a faint crescent, offered shadows for him to blend into. It followed without hesitation, unblinking, patient, relentless. John felt the weight of inevitability, yet within that inevitability, he discovered a strange exhilaration. He had the power to decide the terms of the sacrifice. At the edge of the frozen river, he paused, listening. The hunter was near, silent, sensing, calculating. John drew a deep breath and stepped forward. He made himself visible. He became the lure. The wind carried his scent, his presence, and the figure paused for a moment as if appreciating the elegance of the trap. Then it advanced. John had one thought as he met its gaze. For my children, I will endure anything. Every fear, every pain, every threat, he would absorb it all. He would become the shield, the diversion, the instrument that allowed Emily and Marcus to continue existing beyond this moment. He understood something profound and terrifying. Love was not enough. Sacrifice was required. And only through calculated sacrifice could innocence survive. He stepped onto the ice, careful to test each patch for stability. The hunter followed, its form bending unnaturally, impossibly. He led it toward a section of the river he had marked days earlier. Thin ice covered dark water, hidden beneath the fresh snow. It was a trap, subtle and patient. If he succeeded, the hunter would fall, and his children would live. If he failed, he would be the first to be claimed, but even then, he had chosen that outcome, and in it, there was purpose. As the first cracks began to sound beneath his feet, he heard a distant shout. Emily, Marcus. He ignored it. The sound was a risk, but it also confirmed the plan. The children were safe inside the cabin. His focus narrowed to a single line of calculation. Distance, weight, movement, consequence. Every instinct honed. Every decision reduced to precision. And when the ice fractured beneath the hunter's mass, plunging it into the freezing river, John did not rejoice. There was no time for triumph. Only the cold, the night, and the knowledge that he had bought a single moment of safety for his children. He retreated into the shadows, silent, unbroken. His heart still ached, but not with fear. It ached with the quiet satisfaction of having fulfilled his role. In that moment, John Hale became more than a man. He became a principle, a force, a testament to the lengths one would go to protect the innocent. The night swallowed him, and the children slept, unaware of the full extent of the sacrifice, yet somehow, instinctively, knowing they were shielded. The cabin was colder than it should have been. Emily huddled beneath the thin blanket, her head resting on Marcus's shoulder. The two of them sat perfectly still, as though even the slightest movement might shatter the fragile safety John had bought for them. The fire had long since gone out, leaving a thin haze of smoke lingering like a ghost. Marcus rubbed his small hands together, attempting to create warmth that the cabin could not provide. John did not return immediately. He did not call. He did not signal. The children had been trained to remain silent, and they did. They counted the seconds in their heads, imagining that each passing moment brought them closer to safety or further into peril. In truth, they were doing what he had taught them, holding still, observing, absorbing the world carefully, storing knowledge of threat and refuge in equal measure. Outside, the snow had thickened, muffling the forest. Branches hung heavy, dripping crystalline tears onto the frozen ground. John moved like a shadow between the trees, his movements calculated, deliberate, almost imperceptible. Every footfall was a measure, every breath a regulated input. He was no longer merely running. He was orchestrating survival, bending the environment into an extension of his strategy. It had been hours since the hunter had plunged through the ice, and John was acutely aware that such victories were temporary. The entity was patient. It did not forget. It did not tire. He had bought time, not safety. Time was all he had, and he spent it meticulously mapping each possibility, each potential approach the predator might take. The forest was a grid, the shadows a network, and he was a node sending signals, drawing lines, testing probabilities. He paused at the edge of a frozen creek, scanning the horizon. The hunter had vanished, retreating back into the world of intelligence that lurked just beyond human perception. But John knew it was learning. Every action he had taken would now inform its calculations. He was no longer fighting blind. Every choice he had made, the frozen river, the broken ice, the precise patterns of movement, was a lesson for the entity. And he had one objective: to ensure that lesson remained incomplete. The children's safety was not about hiding alone. It was about shaping the environment, bending it to mislead, to absorb threat, to make the predator expend itself in pursuit. He would continue to sacrifice his comfort, his safety, his body, and eventually perhaps his very life, but it would be calculated. Every loss would be measured, every pain endured intentionally. Nothing would be random. Nothing would be wasted. Hours passed. John returned to the cabin silently, just as Emily and Marcus were beginning to stir. They did not speak. He did not speak. Their eyes met briefly, and in that look he conveyed everything. He was alive, but the danger had not vanished. He had done what needed to be done, but the true trial was only beginning. He fed them sparingly, water from a creek he had filtered and berries he had gathered carefully. Every morsel was rationed, every action a consideration of efficiency versus necessity. He explained nothing, not because he was cruel, but because words were luxury, and in this world luxury could kill. The children learned to trust in action, not explanation. They learned that survival depended on discipline, not understanding. The nights grew longer, darker. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly, each shadow a potential threat. John could hear the hunter moving somewhere in the distance, not close enough to see, but present enough to sense in the subtle shifts of air, the vibrations in the snow. It was patient. It was learning patience. He had no illusions. The entity would adapt, and so must he. In the meantime, he began to teach his children something far more dangerous than hiding or fleeing. He taught them to observe, to calculate, to anticipate. Emily learned to listen for shifts in the wind, the subtle snapping of twigs. Marcus learned to notice patterns in the darkness, the way shadows could signal movement. They practiced silently, the lessons woven into the rhythm of their breaths and heartbeats. John realized something critical. Survival was not about strength or speed. It was about intelligence, adaptability, and sacrifice. He would bear the cost, every consequence, every injury, every moment of fear, so that his children could survive unbroken. The lesson was harsh, but it was absolute. Life demanded calculation, and innocence demanded shield. Days passed. The hunter's presence grew subtler, more integrated into the fabric of the forest. It no longer rushed or charged blindly. It studied, waited, and probed. John adapted his patterns, leaving false trails, decoys of footprints, and misleading signals. He became both the bait and the camouflage, a constant variable in a shifting equation of survival. At night, he listened to the children breathing, counted their heartbeats in the dark, and understood the depth of the commitment he had made. Every day, every moment, was an extension of himself. He was the line between their lives and the predator. And he knew the inevitable truth. There would come a moment when the line would have to be drawn sharply, definitively, and he would walk it alone. But until then, every step, every breath, every calculated risk was a promise. He would endure, he would manipulate, he would deceive. He would be the shield, the bait, and the guide. He had chosen this path. There was no turning back. And in the silence, in the endless snow, he felt the cold clarity of purpose that only comes to those who truly understand sacrifice. John had long stopped being merely a father. He was now a strategy, a force, a living plan whose only function was to preserve the innocence and lives of two small children in a world that had learned to take everything. He was already preparing for the moment when he would have to make the final choice, the ultimate act of selflessness. And in that preparation he found a strange peace. The forest had changed. Snow fell more sparsely now, leaving patches of bare ground that revealed the faint decay of leaves, twigs, and last year's remnants. John moved carefully, observing every shift in the wind, every tremor in the snow. The hunter had adapted. It no longer followed the predictable paths, no longer rushed with hunger or impatience. It had learned from him. John understood then the full scale of the threat. It was not merely a creature of violence. It was a sentience that calculated, analyzed, and remembered. Every misstep, every instinctive decision he had made in the past days had been absorbed and incorporated into its patterns. The predator was patient, and it was clever. He returned to the cabin briefly, checking on Emily and Marcus. Their eyes were sharper now, alert, but still trusting. They had learned the quiet lessons of observation, of anticipation, of restraint. He watched them and felt a pang of guilt. Every moment of their childhood had been stolen by necessity, replaced with strategy, vigilance, and fear measured like rations. But there was no alternative. That night he set traps. Not for the children, not for himself, but for the predator. Simple things at first. Broken branches that would snap under weight, lines of twigs arranged to signal movement, patterns in snow meant to mislead. He imagined the hunter following them, its mind deciphering the false paths, overcomplicating its calculations. It would tire. It would miscalculate. Hours passed. The predator did not appear. It was there, John knew, but it did not need to reveal itself. It was the ghost in the trees, the silence behind the snow, the weight in the air. And yet John felt no fear. Fear had become irrelevant. Calculation had replaced it. Strategy had replaced it. Every action, every choice was a tool, a weapon, a shield. He spent the night planning, considering every possible encounter. The children slept fitfully, stirring occasionally but never crying. He listened to their breathing, their small movements, cataloged them as he would a dataset, noting their resilience, their patterns, their capacity to respond. By morning he had a plan. Not an escape, not a surrender, but a strategy of confrontation that required him alone. The predator had to be led into a position where its power could be measured, contained, and ultimately neutralized, or at least diverted long enough for Emily and Marcus to remain safe. He gathered supplies silently. Rope, flares, rocks, anything that could serve as a decoy or a tool of redirection. Every item had a purpose. Every motion had a meaning. The forest was alive with possibilities, and he would use them all. When he emerged from the treeline, he left clear trails leading away from the cabin. Snow tracks, footprints, broken twigs, even a dropped glove. Each clue was designed to feed the predator's curiosity, to draw it toward him, to make it believe he was fleeing in confusion or desperation. He waited. Hours passed. The forest remained silent. Then a shadow moved. A subtle shift, almost imperceptible, blending into the gray of the trees. John's breath did not quicken. His heart did not race. Every nerve was alert, cataloging, measuring, recording. The predator had arrived. It was magnificent, terrifying, beyond the comprehension of any ordinary human. Its form shifted constantly, a wave of shapes and sizes, blending animal, human, and something beyond both. Eyes that seemed to reflect memory, intelligence, hunger. It moved with purpose, tracing the path he had designed for it, analyzing, recalculating, testing the signals he had left behind. John led it further from the cabin, deeper into the forest. Every step was a commitment. Every step was a sacrifice. He knew the children were safe in their hiding place, protected by layers of deception, but he also knew the predator would adapt faster than he anticipated. He had one chance, one precise moment, to draw it into the final trap. He reached a clearing, wide and open, ringed with pines. He had prepared it carefully. Hidden pits, weighted flares, trip lines, branches arranged to funnel movement. The predator entered, moving cautiously, but John could see the calculation in its shifting form. It understood instinctively that this was a setup. That understanding was dangerous, but also a vulnerability. It had to commit to its choice. John waited, breathing slowly, listening to the subtle changes in air and sound. Then, with a deliberate motion, he stepped into the center of the clearing. He drew the predator's gaze directly, his body tense but controlled. His eyes met the shifting intelligence, and in that instant he understood everything. The predator would follow him, would strike at him, and in doing so would enter the trap he had built. It lunged. The forest erupted in motion. Flares ignited, snow and ice scattered, and the carefully designed pitfalls worked. The predator stumbled, recalculated, adapted, but John had anticipated every possible adjustment. The clearing became a theater of survival, each element designed to delay, distract, and confine. He did not flee. He could not flee. His sacrifice was total. Every step he had taken, every calculation, every misdirection, every moment of danger was designed to preserve the children. He became the pivot point around which the predator moved, the lure that allowed their escape. The hours stretched. The predator struggled, adapting to every obstacle, but each adaptation played into the next stage of his plan. Exhaustion began to touch it, slowing its precision, dulling its reflexes. John moved with it, a constant shadow, a living decoy, guiding, redirecting, sacrificing himself in precise increments. Somewhere in the distance, snow shifted subtly. Emily and Marcus watched from the cabin, their breaths shallow but steady, trusting in the father who had taught them the meaning of patience, observation, and survival. They did not see the full danger, nor did they need to. All they knew was that the man they relied on had become more than a father. He had become a protector, a barrier, a plan brought to life. And in the growing darkness of the forest, John prepared for the final moment. The moment when he would ensure the predator could no longer reach them, when the children would be free to emerge, and when his own life would merge completely with the design he had created. Every choice, every step, every breath had led to this point. He smiled briefly, a fleeting expression of grim satisfaction, as the predator lunged once more into the clearing. The trap held. Night had fallen completely. The forest was no longer just cold and silent. It was suffocating. Shadows pooled under twisted trees like spilled ink, and every branch seemed to twitch with intent. The snow that remained crunched underfoot in a way that sounded far too loud, each echo bouncing back as if the woods themselves were listening. John's breath came in ragged intervals, but not from exhaustion. Every inhalation was a calculated risk. The predator had changed. Its form now shifted more violently than before, morphing into grotesque, impossible shapes, sometimes almost human, sometimes something else, something that smelled of fear itself. He could hear the faint scrape of claws, or maybe fingernails, against bark, but every sound seemed to come from every direction at once. He realized he was being hunted not just physically but mentally. The predator did not just stalk him. It invaded his thoughts. He saw fragments of the cabin in the shadows, the children's frightened faces reflected in the moonlight, twisted and elongated. The predator fed not on flesh alone, but on anticipation, on dread, on the exact moment when hope trembled. John's hands trembled, but only slightly. He had trained them to tremble only when necessary, to measure fear precisely, to convert it into action. He set the traps. Hidden pits lined with sharpened stakes, flares rigged to ignite in blinding arcs, tripwires connected to collapsing branches. But each trap seemed less certain now. The predator anticipated. It sniffed the air and read the snow, testing his patterns, analyzing his methods with an intelligence that was both alien and horrifyingly familiar. He could feel its presence pressing against him now, a wave of cold and hunger that seemed to seep into his bones. When it moved, it did not make noise, and when it paused, it left an emptiness behind. A silence so complete that the snow under his boots felt like it could betray him. He wondered, for the first time in days, if he had underestimated it. Then he saw it. A figure emerging from the darkness beyond the clearing, twisted and fluid, with a mouth that stretched too wide, eyes that reflected all the fears he had buried. It moved in bursts, sometimes fast, sometimes impossibly slow, each motion deliberate, calculated to unnerve. and it whispered, not in words, but in a chorus of voices he recognized. Echoes of townsfolk, fragments of Emilius' laughter, the wail of a distant child he had never known. It was a predator that could speak fear, and it was speaking directly to him. John stepped forward. Each motion was deliberate, each footfall a note in a symphony of survival. The predator responded, warping the snow beneath its shifting form, leaving trails of distorted impressions, as if reality itself bent around it. Its eyes, or what passed for eyes, glimmered with something almost human. Curiosity, malice, calculation. It had learned him, and yet he had learned it too. The traps snapped into motion, and for a brief moment the predator faltered. Flares ignited, illuminating its shifting form in bursts of white-hot light, casting monstrous shadows against the trees. Branches collapsed around it, snow fell in clouds, and it screamed. Not a sound of pain, but a low, grinding, impossible noise that felt like teeth scraping against stone. John knew the sound was designed to break him, to make him falter, to lure him into panic. He did not falter. He advanced, drawing it deeper into the clearing, into the snare he had meticulously constructed. His mind raced, cataloging every option, every escape, every sacrifice he might yet make. He was not thinking of himself. He was thinking of Emily and Marcus, hidden in the cabin, trusting him utterly. Every second he delayed, every step he took, kept them alive. The predator lunged. Its form exploded into something that was both liquid and jagged, flowing over the snow like smoke with teeth. John dodged, barely, and his body ached with the precision of exertion. He felt the proximity of its hunger like a heat wave through his chest, and for a terrifying instant, he imagined it inside him, consuming him alive. He allowed himself one flash of fear, not to control him but to sharpen him. It was a predator that thrived on perfect control, on the absence of human instinct. He reintroduced instinct. He ran erratically, unpredictable, weaving through traps that were no longer obvious even to him, leaving false trails, collapsing small snowbanks behind him to confuse its sensors. The forest became a cage. Trees groaned, shadows bent, and the predator's form tore through the space, relentless, almost gleeful. Its whispers began layering. First Emily's voice, then Marcus, then his own memories twisted into threats. It had become a creature of reflection and distortion, using his love for his children against him. John knew the final move was coming. He had designed it weeks ago for this moment. He could lure the predator into the deepest pit, rigged not just for capture but for containment, but only if he drew it in personally. The trap would not survive his absence. It would not survive anyone else's presence. He turned, planting himself squarely in the predator's path, and spoke. Not words of reason, not words of negotiation. Words of challenge, words of inevitability, words of complete surrender to purpose. He became the target. He became the bait. He became the line in the snow that the predator could not ignore. It surged toward him, a hurricane of teeth, claws, and impossibility. Its scream tore through the forest, echoing in a way that made the air itself tremble. John braced, and in that instant, everything narrowed to a single act. His body, his mind, his will, everything was a bridge for the predator to follow, away from the children, into the trap, into the snare he had built with meticulous care. And as he fell, as the predator lunged over him, the trap ignited in a burst of snow, flame, and ice. The predator screeched, twisted, faltered, and for the first time it was caught. John could not see the outcome clearly. He only knew that the children were safe, that the predator, whatever it had been delayed, neutralized, or contained, that his life, spent in calculation, in fear, in relentless sacrifice, had fulfilled its final purpose. In the silence that followed, the forest seemed almost normal again. Snow fell gently, undisturbed. Shadows bent naturally. The trap smoldered quietly. And somewhere, in the dark, the predator learned that even it could be outmaneuvered, even it could be contained, and even the most intelligent malice could be delayed by the will of a parent willing to give everything. John Hale did not rise again. But Emily and Marcus did, stepping out of the cabin with cautious hope, unaware that their father had become more than human. He had become a shield, a ghost, a precise calculation of love and terror entwined. And the forest held its breath, waiting for the next shadow. Dawn arrived slowly. The forest was quiet, unnaturally quiet. Snow lay thick on the ground, smoothing over the traces of battle. Emily and Marcus stepped from the cabin, their small feet leaving prints that seemed fragile in a world that had just trembled. The air smelled faintly of smoke and iron, as though the forest itself had remembered the night before and sighed in relief. They searched for their father. His absence was immediate, physical, but their minds refused to fill the emptiness with reality. Emily expected him to appear from behind a tree, smiling, a little tired but whole. Marcus expected him to laugh, to scold gently for wandering so close to danger. Neither sound came. The predator had been caught, or so they thought. But the air carried something else, a weight that pressed on their chests, a quiet hum of vigilance, of fear sharpened and contained. The forest no longer hid secrets. It broadcasted them. Hours passed, then a day. The children were alone, not because the predator had returned, but because the world itself seemed to hold its breath. Shadows moved differently, stretching long in impossible ways. Snow melted in strange patterns, revealing footprints that were sometimes theirs, sometimes unknown. Emily tried to remember the sound of her father's voice, but it seemed to twist in her mind. Marcus clutched her sleeve. "He said it would be okay," he whispered, but she could not tell if the words belonged to him or to her imagination. Then the whispers began. Not like the predator, not the screaming, not the voices that had mimicked their lives, but soft, insistent murmurs. They were echoes of their father's calm logic, his careful instructions, embedded in memory like tiny mechanical devices. Breathe slowly. Step carefully. Never let fear surprise you. Emily shivered. She realized the horror of it. John had not simply saved them. He had rewritten the rhythm of their survival. The predator's power might have been delayed or contained, but its lessons were now theirs. Fear had been preserved, refined, and internalized. It no longer visited them as chaos, but as constant awareness. They wandered back to the cabin, finding it empty but meticulously arranged. Every shelf, every blanket, every small object was exactly where it should be. It was the world their father had left them. Precise, predictable, and yet oppressive. Even in his absence, he had designed it to function. Night returned. Stars blinked coldly above, indifferent. Emily and Marcus lay in bed, but neither could sleep. Shadows moved in patterns that were not natural. Every creak of the cabin was measured and deliberate, as if the house itself were testing them. And then they heard it. A soft sound in the trees. Not a growl, not a scream, not the predator itself. Something else. Something that had learned. A whisper in the wind. Footsteps that were not theirs. The predator had been trapped, yes, but its essence lingered. Emily whispered Marcus' name. He answered, their voices small but tethered. They huddled together, listening. The predator had been outsmarted, but the lesson remained. Danger could be calculated, delayed, and contained, but never entirely destroyed. Their father's sacrifice had saved them, but it had left a residue. Fear had become structure. Survival had become precision. Love had become a mechanism. The next morning, the children walked to the edge of the forest. They could see the traps, the snare, the evidence of the struggle. It was over and yet not over. Marcus reached for Emily's hand. They understood, in a way too young for words. Their father was gone, but his presence remained in every measure of caution, every heartbeat calibrated, every glance at the forest. And somewhere deep inside, a part of them longed for the chaos he had faced alone. The predator might survive another day, another night, but the children now carried something more dangerous. A quiet, internal vigilance shaped by a father's calculated love and the horrific clarity of what it took to keep them alive. They stepped forward together. The forest was waiting, but they were not afraid. Not in the way they had been. They were precise. They were aware. They were ready. And the predator, trapped or not, would have to wait.